Hello, America and the world. This is Radio Free Market, and I am your host, Michael McKay. We are behind the lines of socialism, my friends, and Radio Free Market is the voice of free people and free markets. Our topic today is how to create new jobs for real with Dr. Walter Block. Welcome, Walter.
Thanks, Michael. I'm delighted to be on your show.
Well, we're at Radio Free Market. We're delighted to have you back again. So everyone, I want you all to be reminded that Dr. Block is a professor of economics at Loyola University in New Orleans. He is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, the author of Defending the Undefendable, and recently was given the title of Mr. Libertarian. And I think that is far too modest a way of introducing you, but we don't really have time to present all of all of your background, Walter.
Well, I don't think it's far too modest. I think it's far too the opposite, because Murray Rothbard was called that, and I don't know that I deserve to be called the same thing as Murray, but thanks in any case.
Well, it wasn't me that, as you know, it wasn't me that came up with that. That was Lou Rockwell that actually decided that you should be given that particular title. So, everyone, we also have Mr. Aaron Brown with us today, and I want to welcome Aaron. Hello.
Hello. Glad to be back.
All right, great. So, everyone, Aaron Brown attends the University of San Diego Business School and is a 2010 graduate of Mises University. And I want to credit Aaron for not only being our special commentator today, but also for being the chief architect for this show, and the reason that we actually are having this show today. You know, I consider this topic of how to create new jobs for real and the whole discussion about jobs as one of the most foundational topics, and this to be one of the most foundational shows that we will do here at Radio Free Market. And I'm going to encourage our listeners to listen to this show more than once, to take notes, to generously share it with your friends and family and everyone you care about. So now I'd like to hand the show over to get started to Mr. Aaron Brown. Go ahead, Aaron.
Okay, so today's show, it's based on an article that Dr. Block wrote. It's called A Primer on Jobs and the Jobless, and it's on Mises.org. It's dated March 9th of 2004. And so our objective today is just to cut through the kind of the impenetrable facade of the jobs question. And our show for the audience is just how do we create new jobs, meaningful jobs. So I think it's useful to begin the conversation, just ask ourselves, what are new jobs good for? What purpose do they serve? So I wanted to ask you, Walter, are jobs desirable per se in and of themselves?
Well, I follow Hazlitt on this, and really jobs are not desirable per se. They're only desirable because of the things that jobs make available, namely goods and services. If we had, if we were living in, what shall I say, nirvana, and manna came down from the heavens in the form of whatever we wanted. You know, you want a Maserati, you get a Maserati. You want a Rolls Royce, you sort of look at the manna and it turns into a Rolls Royce. Then we wouldn't need jobs. Unfortunately, we don't live in any such situation. We live in the real world. And in the real world, we have this thing called scarcity, which means that we have more desires than things that we have. So we have to work for the things that we want that we don't have. I mean, happily, we have some things like air and other, good things. But there are a lot of things that we want that we don't have, and that's why we have to have jobs. So jobs are important as a means toward the end of goods and services, but they're not good intrinsically themselves.
Okay. Now, unfortunately, this first segment is already coming to a very rapid ending, and so before we get into our next question, Walter, what we'll do is we'll take a brief commercial break, and when we come back, folks, we're going to continue with Dr. Walter Block on our conversation of how to create new jobs for real. And so please stay with us. This is Radio Free Market. I'm your host, Michael McKay, and we'll be back in just a minute. Please stay with us. And welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market. We're talking with Dr. Walter Block on jobs. And so I would like to ask Aaron Brown to continue the conversation we were just having. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, so I asked Dr. Block if jobs are desirable in themselves. And I remember Peter Schiff said one time, said the purpose of the economy is it's not to create jobs, it's really to eliminate jobs. It's to make the economy so productive that people don't have to work so often. And in your article, you wrote, Dr. Block, that were jobs in the Soviet Union desirable, where millions of workers were just building things that no one wanted. In that case, jobs are obviously not desirable.
Yes, quite right. Jobs are a means to an end, and the end is things we want. And if the jobs are making things that we don't want, well, then let's say the Keynesian thing of digging holes and filling them up again, then that's silly. I mean, what's the point of working to dig a hole and then fill it up again and keep doing it endlessly when no one really wants a filled-in hole? We want maybe a hole that we can put a building in or something like that. So I think Peter Schiff is quite right in saying that we want jobs, not any old jobs, but jobs that produce things that we want.
At this particular point, I think for me, when I've heard you lecture on this topic before, really brings it out that you really say that the whole focus is on the wrong word. It shouldn't be on the word jobs. It should be on the word production. Would you comment more on that?
Oh, yes, I entirely agree. The key is that we want goods and services. We want food. We want clothing. We want shelter. We want health care. We want, violin lessons and all sorts of things. And that's the focus on productivity. And Hazlitt and Peter Schiff and others, Rothbard, Mises, have made this point very tellingly, that a job is a bad thing. It's a necessary evil, but it's an evil. Nobody really wants a job per se. Now, there is such a thing called play. Like, for example, the people who are now playing in the National Football League, I assume they enjoy doing what they're doing, and they get paid very well for it. So ideally, the key would be that everyone doesn't work at their job, but plays at their job. So all jobs are play jobs. Namely, we all enjoy what we're doing. I'm no National Football League person, but I'm a professor of economics, and I tell you, I love the job. Don't tell my dean, because he'll try to lower my salary, but I really love my job. I get to lecture to very bright young undergraduates and tell them that free enterprise is great. And in effect, I'm really playing for my pay. So I and football players and athletes and I imagine actors and other people and lawyers and accountants and whoever enjoys their job are really playing for pay, and those are the kinds of jobs we want to have.
Okay. Now, Aaron, you and I were talking about this, and you had an example related to General Motors.
Oh, yeah. So, we were all told by the government and the media that, if GM was allowed to go bankrupt, then thousands of people would lose their jobs. But I'm guessing that your objection to that would be, well, were those jobs creating a product that people in fact wanted?
Well, we can't really call them General Motors anymore. I think we have to now call them GM Government Motors because they've been really nationalized. And my understanding is that these guys were getting like $75, $80 per hour when you include their fringe benefits.
Right.
Now, I'm not going to cast aspersions on GM products, but the point is that not only do we have to create things that people want, but we have to create things that people want at less cost than they value it at. In other words, if we value a car at $5,000 and it costs $10,000 to make that car, then that's not a good job. And in the free enterprise system, what would have happened is that these people would have lost their jobs happily because they were taken over by unions, and I regard unions as some sort of gigantic tapeworm that just sucks out the nutrients from the host. These people would have gone unemployed, and then they might have been picked up by, I don't know, Toyota or Honda, or other automobile manufacturers who pay not 75 or 80 bucks an hour, but 20, 30 bucks an hour. And they're located mainly in the South, which is non-union territory. So it's not that these people would have been permanently unemployed. They would have been saved from the tapeworm of unionism, and they would have got jobs at salaries that are more congruent with their productivity levels, whereas now they were paying way more than their productivity levels. I assume their productivity levels are something like 20 or 30 bucks an hour. But if they're paid much more than that, there's only one way to go, and that's that the company that's employing them is going to lose money and go broke. And the only way they can stay in business is if the government supports them. But this is very bad. It's as if instead of paying them to dig holes and fill them up again, we're paying them to produce, let's say, good cars for the sake of argument, but at twice the cost of the value that we place on those cars. So not only does a job have to produce stuff that we want, but it has to produce stuff that we want at a price that is fitting with the value that we place on it.
You know, so for our listening audience, I want to clarify something. These first few questions are the foundation for wanting to know what is going on in the jobs market. We want to make sure that everyone is asking the right questions that get at the root of what creates prosperity. So to finish off these introductory remarks and questions, I want to read a quote from the article that you wrote, Dr. Block, and how it captures the core issue perfectly, in my opinion. You write, imagine a world where radios, pizzas, jogging shoes, and everything else we might want continuously rain down like manna from heaven. Would we want jobs in such a utopia? No, we would devote ourselves to other tasks, basking in the sun, etc., that we would undertake for their intrinsic pleasure. Instead of praising jobs for their own sake, we should ask why employment is so important. The answer is because we exist amidst economic scarcity and must work to live and prosper. That's why we should be of good cheer only when we learn that this employment will produce things people actually value, are willing to buy with their own hard-earned money. And this is something that can only be done in a free market, not by bureaucrats and politicians. That's the end of your quote. Now, I know that summarizes and actually reiterates some of the things and comments that you made earlier, but when we were crafting this show, we thought that the way you phrased that particular statement was so vitally important, we wanted to reiterate it even if you did say it earlier. So thank you very much for that. And Aaron, I'm going to let you just leap forward onto the next topic while we still have time in this segment. Go ahead.
All right. So with that frame of mind, we want to begin the meat of the article, and you laid out a couple of points, and you started with the minimum wage. And I think we're all kind of taught to believe that the minimum wage is kind of I actually had one of my friends say, we've chosen to live in a society where we have a certain minimum standard of living, and that's why we have the minimum wage. So first I want to define what it is. The minimum wage, for our listeners, is a government law that forces business people to pay their employees no less than a certain wage. And if you're caught paying less than that, the government will either fine you or force your business to close. And again, Walter, we're told that the minimum wage helps the economy, and specifically poor people. It helps poor people, right? That's what we're told. How does the minimum wage hurt those very poor people that it's supposed to help?
Well, the minimum wage, most people when they think of the minimum wage, they think of it as a floor under wages, and the higher you push it, the higher wages get pushed. So if we have a minimum wage of $4 an hour, no one can go below the floor of $4 an hour, but that's pretty niggardly, so let's raise it to $5 an hour. Now we raise the minimum wage to $5 an hour, and everyone gets paid $5 an hour. Isn't that great? But wait, we can raise it to $6 and $7. I think it's now $7 and change. So the higher we raise it, the higher wages are at the low end of the income job pyramid. That is the erroneous theory. The correct theory is that jobs are minimum wage is more like a hurdle over which you have to jump in order to get a job in the first place. So if the minimum wage law is $5 an hour and your productivity is $4 an hour, well, then anyone who hires you at $5 an hour when you're only adding to their bottom line $4 an hour, it's going to cost you, the employer, $1 an hour. And if you hire people like that, you're going to lose money. And if you hire too many like that, you're going to go broke. So
Right.
the minimum wage law is really not a law that raises wages. It's a law that cuts off people whose productivity is below the minimum wage level. Now, one easy way to see this is suppose, if it were really true that the minimum wage law could raise wages, why stop at $5, $6, $7, $8 an hour, $10 an hour? Why not make it $1,000 an hour? Why not have a minimum wage law for $1,000 an hour, and then everyone will make $1,000 an hour, and wouldn't that be great?
Right.
Well, the proponents of minimum wage law never follow the logic of their argument, because if we had a minimum wage law of $1,000 an hour, and the only people who have $1,000 an hour productivity in them are people like, I don't know, Tom Cruise or Nadal, the tennis player, most of us, virtually all of us, would be unemployed because we're just not worth $1,000 an hour. Our productivity is not $1,000 an hour. If our productivity were $100 an hour, and that's pretty good, you have to be pretty good to have $100 an hour productivity, and the employer was forced to pay you $1,000 an hour, he'd lose $900 an hour on you, and that's not a viable situation.
So we're going to talk more about this issue of minimum wage, because I think this is a fundamental issue also that most people have a very incorrect understanding of. And I thank you very much for bringing out these points, Dr. Block. So we'll get a bit more into this when we come back from our break. So everyone, please stay with us. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay. We're talking with Dr. Walter Block about how to create new jobs for real. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back, everyone. So, Dr. Block, before the break, we were talking about the minimum wage and how it hurts the very people that it's supposed to help. You gave the analogy of, let's say, a minority worker or a young person as being like a porcupine, and that the minimum wage harms these minorities in the same way that removing the porcupine's quills harms the porcupine. I think this is a very instructive example that you've presented in some of your literature. And can you share a bit more of that with us?
Yes, there are certain animals, like the porcupine, that would be very helpless without their quills. Other animals that would be helpless without their compensating differential. The deer has fleetness of foot. Otherwise, if it was slow, it would be slaughtered. The skunk has, well, you can imagine what the skunk has, but if it didn't have that smell, it too would be a victim. Well, what does a minority teenage worker have? What ability does he have in order to get a job when people are suspicious of him or maybe even prejudiced against him? What he has is the ability, in the free market that is, to work for a lower wage. So if there were an employer who was looking askance at this, say, young black teenage worker and saying, well, do I really want to give this kid a chance? If the kid could come up and say, look, like a Horatio Alger type of story, look, give me $1 an hour, stinking lousy $1 an hour. Let me work for you. I'll work for you for a week for $1 an hour, and I'll show you that my productivity is $5, $6, $8, $10 an hour. And after the week, you can raise my wage if you want to keep me, because if I'm really going to add to your bottom line and only take $1 an hour, it's to your advantage. And I think that having this ability to say this would help a young kid get a job where the employer might not give him the job. But with the minimum wage law, it would be illegal for the employer to go along with that. If he paid the kid $1 an hour just to give him a chance, he'd go to jail for it, or he'd be fined, or he'd be forced to shut down. Mm-hmm. So what the minimum wage law does is takes away the ability of a weak economic actor, akin to a weak animal without the quills or the smell or the fleetness of foot. And this is very despicable to pick on the lowest members of society or the economy, people who have the lowest productivity. Now you might ask, well, why, if the minimum wage law is so lousy, if it's taking away the ability of workers to offer employers this this sort of a deal to work for a low wage just as a trial period. Well, why do we have the bloody law in the first place? And the answer to that is one of my least favorite institutions, second to government perhaps, is unions. See, when a union goes to the employer and says, look, we're making $20 an hour, we need 25, the first thing that the employer thinks of is, well, let me fire a few of these high-priced workers and hire a few dozen low-wage workers, and then, the skilled workers can be sort of foremen for the unskilled workers. But the last thing that the union wants is for the employer to start looking for low-skilled alternatives, and they call them scabs, and they used to beat them up. But now they're much more sophisticated, and they've come up with a law, the minimum wage law, which cuts this off at the root. It doesn't enable the employer to start firing union workers, high-paid skilled workers, and start hiring many more unskilled workers to take their place.
So you're saying when we look at this logically, the minimum wage actually, it creates a semi-permanent sector of unemployment, and it harms really the whole of society, but particularly weak economic actors.
Precisely. The unemployment rate for overall is 9.6, 9.7, something like that. According to the shadow statistics, which I think are much more accurate, the overall employment rate for society is something like 19 or 20%. I might be a bit off.
Actually, it just went over 22%.
Oh, 22%. Well, thanks.
Yeah, John, and for our listeners, Dr. Black just referred to something we've encouraged our listeners to look into. This is shadowstats.com, and it's run by a gentleman by the name of John Williams, and I encourage you to go to his website at shadowstats.com and download some of the free data that he has, and it outlines how the government has systematically changed the accounting procedures over the last 40 years so that what we are actually looking at in statistics that we see reported are not actually the same kind of accounting methodologies that were used back in the 1950s, for example. So they've doctored these various different metrics from labor statistics and inflation and CPI and so on and so forth. It's an invaluable site. I recommend everyone to look into it. So I'm sorry I interrupted Aaron and Walter. Please go ahead.
No. That's quite a very important contribution. I hadn't looked at that for a while, so I was a little outdated. I thought it was 19 or 20%. I'm happy to be corrected that it's 22%. But the unemployment rate for male black teens is 50%, 50, not 15, but 50.
Gosh.
50%, which is horrendous, and I think a lot of that is due to the minimum wage law, and it might conceivably even be higher when you take into fact the phenomenon called the discouraged worker phenomenon. And this is the point is that the way the government counts unemployment is you have to be actively looking for a job. But if you've been actively looking for a job and not finding one for a year or so, and the duration of unemployment, even for adult workers, is now very high in our present depression, recession. So if you're discouraged and you're not even looking for a job, then by the magic of statistical lies, you're no longer unemployed. So the real unemployment rate, when you take this into account, is perhaps even higher.
Okay, Walter, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to come into our next break. So everyone, please stay with us, and we'll be back in just a minute. This is Radio Free Market, and we'll be back right after the break.
Okay, and we're back on Radio Free Market with Dr. Walter Block. So, Walter, in past shows, we've delved into the topic of how government kind of tinkering with the economy, it causes changes in people's behavior and influences how they act. In your article, you write of how the minimum wage, it causes unemployment, which we've discussed before the break, but it also causes dependency. It causes loneliness and isolation. And that was kind of a striking comment to me. How does this happen? How does unemployment cause dependency and isolation?
Well, I mean, if you're unemployed, a lot of people, their self-image, and I'm no sociologist or psychologist, but I think a lot of people's self-image is tied up in their job. I tell you, there were times in my own life when I was unemployed, and I wasn't a happy camper about that. The money wasn't coming in, and I have dependents that are dependent upon me to bring the money in. So I was sort of not very happy when I was unemployed, and I assume that when other people are unemployed and want a job and can't find it, that their their self-esteem goes down, or their general level of happiness goes down. They sort of feel like a fish out of water. So I can't imagine that this would be good for people, not only economically, because the money isn't coming in, but socially or psychologically or in any other way.
You know, another example that you give, and I love this example, is the government mandating the salaries of truck drivers and nurses being the same. You know, most people would look at government-mandated pay raise for nurses to the same level as truck drivers as a good thing, especially since women are such a large, segment of the profession. But how does this government-mandated pay raise actually harm the very women it's supposed to help?
Well, just like the minimum wage, if ever you raise wages above productivity levels, for whatever reason, whether it's minimum wage or equal pay for equal work, or a desire to stamp down on sexual discrimination, if you raise people's wages above market levels, above the levels that are congruent with their productivity, well, then you unemploy them. Happily, this government initiative has not really got legs under it. It hasn't really taken fold. Female unemployment rates are roughly the same as male unemployment rates. But if this ever did get into effect, then it would. Now, you see, the reason for it, women earn, on average, about 70% of what men earn. And the thought is that women are just as productive as men nowadays. And I agree. I think, on average, women and men are roughly equally productive. In past centuries, when a lot of jobs took upper body strength, like knocking down trees with a hatchet, or pushing a bale, or lifting lifting a bale, pushing something or other, a barge, then men's productivity was higher than women's. But nowadays, the way we do heavy work is mostly with steam shovels and trucks and things like that, and women are roughly as capable as are men of pushing buttons and levers and turning a steering wheel on a big truck. Mm-hmm. So why then are women earning less than men? And why is it that the progressives, the liberals, the do-gooders, the semi-socialists, why are they trying to push women's wages up? Well, because they think it's unfair, and it's due to the innate discriminatory essence of capitalism. The real reason, though, is very different. The real reason is because women aren't as connected to the labor force as are men. Women have lower productivity in the market because they have an unequal and much higher share of household work, cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, getting up at night when the kid is sick, things like that. Women do much more of that than men. And whenever you do anything, it's always at the cost of something else. For example, LeBron James, I posit, is not a world-class cello player. Why? Well, in order to be a world-class cello, you've got to play the cello 6, 8, 10 hours a day. And LeBron James is a basketball player, and he's not playing the cello 6, 8, 10 hours a day, so he's not a good cello player, even though he might be if he put his mind and his fingers to the cello. Well, women, instead of playing basketball, they're taking care of kids. And whenever you do any one thing, you have to do other things less well than you could have done had you not been doing the first thing. So if women are doing the lion's share of house cleaning and cooking and child care, well, then something's got to give, and it's cello playing and productivity in the market. That's why they make less money. The point is that if women and men were equally productive and women were paid $7 for every $10 an hour that men were paid, this would represent a gigantic profit opportunity for employers. It would be as if every woman had a little lapel pin saying, hire me and you make an extra $3 an hour off of my work. That would not be an equilibrium situation. And when you look at the statistics, the 70% is an amalgam of the never marrieds and the ever marrieds. And if you look at never married male and female, never married means not widowed, not divorced, not separated, not married, not anything. There is no wage gap. There's no wage gap between never married men and never married women. But there's a much bigger than 30% wage gap between ever married men and women. And so this is sort of an indication as to what's really going on. So you might think that the feminists here are filled with the milk of human kindness and in trying to help women who are despised by the market. But they're not despised or trampled on by the market. It's just because they're more into house cleaning and cooking and cleaning and child care.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating presentation there. Aaron, you wanted to bring out this topic of unions, and I know Walter's itching to get into it, so let's go forward with that.
Yeah, so you commented a little bit on it earlier, but I think unions, and it was for me, one of the most difficult issues to understand before I started really studying economics. So briefly, what is a union and how does it work?
Well, a union is a very complicated issue. If there were a union that said, okay, look, we're not going to violate the libertarian axiom of non-aggression, the non-aggression principle, we're going to just do everything according to libertarian theory, then it would be sort of okay. And now, what could a union do if they limited themselves to being compatible with libertarianism? What they could do is they could say something like the following. When one guy goes to the boss and says, hey, boss, I'm making $15 an hour, I need a raise to 20, the boss says, my way or the highway, and fires him. But if all 500 workers agree to have one spokesman go to the boss and say, hey, boss, if you don't give us all a $5 increase from $15 to $20 an hour, we're all going to leave. We're all going to down tools and walk out. Well, now the boss has got to think twice because, it's going to take a little effort to replace 500 people who work on the machine floor, the shop floor, and are coordinated and work together and, are busy producing. And if he tells them all the, my way or the highway, he's going to face a few weeks or months of no productivity, and his stockholders aren't going to be too happy. So there is a legitimate union power. But are there any unions that limit themselves to this? I once did some research on this, and I came up with this, nothing in the U.S., but I came up with this thing called the CLAC, C-L-A-C, Canadian Labour Association of Canada. I think that, no, it's not. That's not the exact word. Canada wouldn't appear twice, but it was CLAC. And they were very religious. I think it was Christian Labor Association of Canada. That's it. And I said, well, look, if you do you limit yourself to just walkouts, or do you threaten scabs? You see, the second thing that the unions do, in addition to saying, well, we're all going to stop working for you, is they're going to say, not only are we going to stop working for you, but we're going to set up picket lines, and the picket lines are going to stop customers from coming in to buy stuff, and it's going to stop suppliers from supplying the raw materials, and also it's going to make sure that you can't hire replacements for us, and we're going to call them scabs, and we're going to beat them up. And the Christian Labor Association of Canada said, oh, no, certainly we're not. We're Christians. We wouldn't do that. And then I said, well, what do you think about labor legislation that forces the employer to deal with you whether he wants to do so or not? And they said, oh, well, we favor labor legislation like that. So even the Christian Labor Association of Canada, which I thought was a pretty good union, bought into this other way of violating the libertarian non-aggression principle, namely they support laws that compel the employer to keep the union or to bargain with him when he wants to get rid of them. He might say, okay, all 500 of you, you're a bunch of bums. I'm going to get replacement workers for you, scabs, as you call them, and, lots of luck or lots of luck. But the CLAC group bought into this. So as far as I'm concerned, there are no legitimate unions, even though theoretically there could be. Okay, so given that
you wrote,
go ahead.
You wrote that if the government forces businesses to hire only union workers, they create unemployment among non-union workers, which I think seems fairly obvious to most people. But if the unions partner with the government to enforce these union agreements and the union workers benefit by receiving higher wages, then how do the individuals in government benefit?
Well, are you talking about public sector unions now?
Well, actually, what we're looking at, it was kind of a trick question, because basically, it's pretty obvious how the union workers benefit in this whole thing, but because they're really partnering with government, whether they're public sector unions or private sector unions, the the question really is oriented around how the bureaucrats in government actually benefit by or politicians and bureaucrats in government benefit from coming up with and enforcing this kind of arrangement. What is the benefit to the actual government politician, to the government bureaucrat?
Well, in the United States, the Democratic Party, the unions are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Democratic Party. And even the Republicans try to ingratiate themselves with the unions because they're well organized, they have a lot of votes. President Obama now is trying to get rid of this secret ballot for certifying new unions, which is a horror. So I would say that the short answer to your question is that the government bureaucrats and particularly politicians gain because they'll get the union votes and the union donations, and unions will go out and stump for them when there's an election, like in the last election that the Republicans won. The unions were very heavily in favor of the Democrats, giving them lots of money and lots of shoes on the ground, going out and handing out leaflets and activities of that sort.
Mm-hmm. Walter, you wrote that unions are a state-protected cartel, just like any other, like a banana cartel or a banking cartel. Of course, we don't have any of those, but can you explain this to us, how unions have the appearance of being a state-protected cartel, or are a state-protected cartel?
Yes, they definitely are, because the Wagner Act and the Taft-Hartley Act and all this other labor legislation has declared certain things to be unfair labor practices. One of them is to refuse to even deal with the union. You have to bargain in good faith with the union. I don't know, it just seems a horrendous thing to me to force people to deal with each other when they don't want to deal with each other. In the libertarian society, all interaction should be strictly on a voluntary basis. So what the government is doing is putting its big fat thumb on one side of the balance and helping unions by forcing employers to deal with them whether they want to or not. See, it's all well and good to refuse that the union wants to down tools and walk away from the job. It's sort of like if a man wants to divorce his wife, okay, it's maybe a personal tragedy, but maybe he has a right to do that. But when the man then gets his friends to surround his ex-wife's house, and any time she wants to date someone else, they beat him up, well, that's not good. And that's exactly what the union is doing. They're saying, look, we don't like these jobs. You're stinking, lousy jobs. You're not paying us enough, and the working conditions aren't enough. We want better air conditioning. And we're going to walk off the job, and we're going to make sure no one else can take these jobs that we don't want. So it would be like the ex-husband refusing to allow his ex-wife to date other men.
And
before we leave this topic about unions, Aaron and I, in our conversations in preparation for this show, we came across quite a bit of information on the public pension time bomb that's coming up. In fact, 60 Minutes this past week, we're taping this show on the 22nd of December, and we're going to actually air this on January 1st, 2011. And this past Sunday, there was a segment on 60 Minutes on how the state and municipal governments are imminently about to be in default because of the, in large measure, because of the pensions that they have granted to their public employees. And so I'm going to hand this back over to you, Aaron, to develop this thread. So please go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for our listeners, if the idea that unions or the unions are a state-protected cartel, if that seems just fantastical to you and just completely out of the realm of normal conversation, consider some of these stats that 70% of Decatur, which is a city in Illinois, 70% of their property taxes, so people are forced at gunpoint to pay property taxes, 70% of those taxes are going to go to fund union pensions. And there are a ton of stats I could rattle off, and I won't waste too much time, but I mean, just think about that. 70% of people's taxes that they're forced to pay on their property are going to fund a union pension which uses the coercive power of government to force up their wages. And again, there are a ton of other stats. We're going to move on to licensing, but I encourage you.
I actually, before we leave this topic, I want to mention one other thing, and then I want to get Walter to comment on it. There was one other stat that you uncovered, Aaron, that I thought was very important for everyone to hear about. One of the things that I was not aware of until we were researching this show is that the public sector unions have a more lenient accounting standard than the private sector unions, and that there is an estimate of about $3 trillion in debt in excess of all outstanding state and government bonds. Now, as a result of that, there is new legislation that was introduced December 2nd in the U.S. House of Representatives called the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act. It's just getting started, but this is a development that everyone needs to be aware of. So, Walter, we only have about another minute in this segment, but would you care to comment on this?
Well, you see, the traditional idea of unions was that the capitalist pig is greedy and the government has to help the poor worker. But if the government is such a good guy and only the capitalist is a bad guy, how do you justify public sector unions at all? Because the government is supposed to be the working man's friend. So why should unions be able to strike against government, who is the good guy? Only the profit-seeking capitalist is a bad guy. On the other hand, I said unions were my second least favorite institution, and my first least favorite one is the government. So when a union and a government are fighting, I'm sort of, I say that I don't really have any dog in this fight, sort of a pox on both houses, sort of like Stalin fighting Hitler. I'm not really a friend of the government either.
Well, the interesting thing about this, and we're really coming fast to the end of this segment, is that up through the 1970s, private company pensions, unions were actually on the wane, and then public sector unions started to develop. And now they are endemic. We have them for everything in the public sector. So we're going to probably have a couple of minutes more to talk about this topic when we come back from our break into our final segment. And so everyone, please stay with us. This is Radio Free Market. And I'm your host, Michael McKay, and I'm talking with Dr. Walter Block, and with me, Mr. Aaron Brown. And we'll be talking with you in just a minute. Please stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market. And so, Aaron Brown, I'm going to hand this over to you so we can cover as much as possible in this last segment. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think this is the most important issue, with relevance to today, the business cycle. You say, Walter, that it has its root cause in the Federal Reserve System. And I really want you to spell out for our listeners how this occurs, because this is really very important, and how this is not just a minor cause. The Federal Reserve is not a minor cause of the business cycle, but it's the capital P. It's the primary cause for the boom-bust cycle or business cycle. Could you explain that?
Yes, I don't want to denigrate the unions nor the minimum wage as a source of unemployment, but I think that in the modern day, perhaps even more important is what the Fed has done. Ron Paul has a book out, End the Fed, and as you know, he's now going to be chairman of the subcommittee that is going to override the Fed or regulate them or audit them, perhaps. What the Fed did is it artificially lowered interest rates practically down to zero. And what that does, according to Austrian business cycle theory of mainly Mises and Hayek and Rothbard, is it encourages, it subsidizes, in effect, entrepreneurs into making malinvestments, into investing in very long-term capital goods like houses and cars. We have housing, overabundance of housing, one because of Fannie and Freddie and HUD and the Boston Fed, which said that there was discriminatory mortgage practices. And another source of the overbuilding of housing is the low interest rate. The low interest rate encourages long-term roundabout processes more than short-term consumer products, direct consumer products, but long-term consumer products such as houses and cars. So we have a vast over-investment in this sector of the economy, and this creates unemployment because we just don't have the jobs there. The housing isn't needed. We have too much housing and therefore too little of other things. And given that the market is not perfectly flexible, the changes in employment from what the Fed has got us into to what we should be creates unemployment. So that's one source of unemployment. Another is a thing that Bob Higgs has called regime uncertainty. The Fed, the Obama administration keep changing things, and it's sort of like businessmen are like deer caught in the headlights. They just don't know what to do, and the last thing they're going to do is start hiring people. And another cause of the depression that we're now undergoing, and therefore the unemployment, similar to what happened with Roosevelt and the Smoot-Hawley tariff, we've got protectionism, which adds a further kibosh on the unemployment situation.
Mm-hmm. So if the government doesn't realize that the Federal Reserve causes the boom-bust cycle, then how can they claim that any of their policies will solve it? They just don't seem to understand.
No, they don't understand because they haven't employed Austrian economists. They've got mainstream macroeconomists, the monetarists and the Keynesians. Well, the monetarists are Keynesians, but that's a whole other issue. The people in the Council of Economic Advisors, and all these are very mainstream economists. Bernanke is a mainstream economist. They don't understand.
So, Walter, I'm going to interrupt you so you can get a quick answer in. The business cycle is a particularly relevant issue today. How do you think the boom-bust cycle problem can be corrected? We need a really quick 20-second answer.
Get rid of the Fed. That's even less than 20 seconds. Get rid of the Fed. Get rid of the Fed. Get rid of the Fed. And get rid of central planning of the monetary system. Get rid of the central bank. Get rid of the Fed. Go back to the gold standard. If we did these things, and elect Ron Paul to be president in 2012, or sooner if possible, let's impeach get Ron Paul in there, and then we'll solve the unemployment problem.
All right, so we're going to have to end on that comment today. So thank you so much, Walter, for being with us today, and you too, Aaron. This is Michael McKay in Radio Free Market. Please visit us on the web at radiofreemarket.com, where you can subscribe for free to all of our shows on iTunes or visit our Radio Free Market archives for easy downloads. And until next week, wherever you are, please stand up for freedom, and thank you for listening.
Hello, America and the world. This is Radio Free Market, and I am your host, Aaron Brown, sitting in today for Michael McKay. We are behind the lines of socialism, my friends, and Radio Free Market is the voice of free people and free markets. Our topic today is how to create new jobs for real, Part 2. And our guest is Dr. Walter Block, Professor of Economics at Loyola University, New Orleans. He's a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and author of Defending the Undefendable, among other titles. Welcome, Walter.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm delighted to be here with you, Aaron and Zoe.
Yeah, glad to be back. And we also have with us today special commentator Zoe Russell. Zoe is a graduate of Auburn University in business economics. She attended Mises University 2009 and continues her study of free market economics in Houston, Texas. So welcome, Zoe.
Hi, good to be here.
Okay, so today's show is the second part of an interview we did with Dr. Block based on an article he wrote called A Primer on Jobs and the Jobless. And our objective here today is to clarify the jobs question and show our audience how to create jobs for real. I think to begin this conversation, we must first ask, what are new jobs good for, Walter? What purpose do they serve? Are jobs desirable in and of themselves?
No, jobs are a bad thing. They're a pain in the neck, otherwise they wouldn't be jobs. But we have to have them because we have scarcity. Scarcity means we want more stuff than we have. And the only way to get it is to work harder or want less. And Gandhi, the ascetic from India, worked on scarcity in the other direction, namely he wanted less and less, although he wanted the British out of India, which is no small thing. But apart from that, he wanted very little, just his diaper and his maybe shoes and maybe some goat's milk or something like that. So his wants were very, very small. But most people aren't like that, and even he wanted that stuff. Whereas most of us, if we had a wish list, what would we like? The sun, the moon, the stars, a cure for cancer, space travel, infinite life, whatever. Lots of things that we want. And since we don't live in the Garden of Eden where stuff comes down onto us like manna, and then we sort of convert the manna into a Maserati or into a yacht or something, we don't have that. So the only way we can get stuff that we want is to work for it, unfortunately. But that's the situation that we're in.
So you talk about in your article the Swiss family Robinson, and we know they're marooned on a desert island. You take us out of a complex economy and show us an economy on the individual level. Can you tell us their story and how it shows that we don't just work for no reason?
Yes, I think the Swiss family Robinson is a good example. They're marooned on some desert island, and they've got a lot of wants and not that much stuff. They've got a wrecked ship and then maybe a hammer and a saw and a few other things, but they need a house to protect them from wild animals. They need to catch some fish. They need to maybe start building a rowboat so they can get out of there eventually. They have a lot of things that they have to do. Now, suppose the 10-year-old is told, okay, go fish, and he gets one fish a day. But he's a bright young lad, and what he does is he builds a net, and now he can make 5 fish a day, and the family, doesn't need that many fish. So he's now unemployed. Well, is this a bad thing? No, it's not a bad thing, because he's unemployed due to the fact of his own brilliance. And now the family can assign him to some other job. And now they can have all the fish they want, or they can have 5 fish a day instead of 1 fish a day. Plus, they can have other things, or they can have 1 fish a day, and since it only takes them, a half hour, an hour to get that 1 fish, 3/4 or 4/5 of his day is now free to do something else. So what I was trying to do here is to get at Ludditism, the idea that machinery will take our jobs away. And the point that Henry Hazlitt makes, a very famous Austrian economist, it's not that we want jobs, it's that we want the things that jobs give us. And in the case of the Swiss family Robinson, we want the fish that this job gave us. And if we can get the fish without the work, because this kid is so brilliant, he makes a net or whatever, well, then that's great.
Let me interrupt you there, Walter. Yeah. We've got to head to a break, but we'll be right back with Radio Free Market.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to Radio Free Market. We're here back with Dr. Walter Block. We were just discussing the Swiss family Robinson. The boy can catch more fish with his net. With his limited resources, including time, he can do much more. Can you elaborate on the idea?
Yeah, what I'm trying to illustrate is Ned Ludd. What happened, this guy was, I forget what century, maybe the 18th century. And before that, the way they knitted shirts and woolens and stuff was the old-fashioned way of knitting that you see old ladies, well, young ladies too, knit. And then they came up with the loom. And the loom could one person could create as many sweaters or as many clothing goods as 20 people before the old-fashioned way. And Ned Ludd said, whoa, we can't have that, because if one person creates 20 sweaters where one person, where it used to take 20 people to create 20 sweaters, well, 19 people will be unemployed. So we did, him and his buddies, they went around burning knitting looms on the ground that he was saving jobs. He didn't realize that we don't need jobs. What we need is the clothing that the jobs make possible. A modern-day Luddite is Ted Kaczynski, who was the Unabomber. He would go and actually bomb factories because factories were producing a lot of stuff. Right now at Loyola University, New Orleans, they're putting in some building. They're uncovering some pipes. They're digging holes. And the way they're doing it is with steam shovels. And it takes 1 or 2 or 3 people, and they can make a big hole in the ground in a couple of days. Whereas if you had people with picks and shovels, it would take, hundreds of people a month. And if they were doing it with teaspoons, it would take thousands of people a year. So we could create jobs endlessly, but the point is not to create jobs. The point is to create the stuff. if we wanted to create millions of jobs, what we could do is get rid of all trains and 18-wheeler trucks and have people ship stuff on their back in the form of 50-pound sacks from New Orleans to, where are you guys living?
Houston.
California.
From New Orleans to Houston or to California even better yet because it's further away. We could create billions of jobs, but the point is that if we did that, then we wouldn't have all the other things that people could do. So I keep reiterating the brilliant Hazlitt point that we want is productivity. We don't want jobs. Jobs are a necessary evil. They're an evil because, they're a pain in the neck. We don't want to do them. We'd rather play. But we have to work sometimes in order to create goods and transmit them hither and thither.
Mm-hmm. And in preparation for this show, we wanted to lead off with that point because that is the crux of the argument, that jobs are not good enough themselves. If we could create machines that, as Dr. Block says, would bring down goods like manna from heaven, even though there were less jobs, that would still be a wonderful thing because we would have the goods that we require to be happy and go out and play and have a high quality of life. So it is the things that jobs create that is the good. The jobs are not the good part. As Dr. Block said, jobs are unpleasant. No one likes jobs. So we want the goods and services that jobs create.
And with regard to play, sometimes you think of playing and you think, well, you play basketball, you play chess. Well, some people could play at creating symphonies or creating new plays or inventing new things to get us to Mars in a better way or whatever.
Or being economics professors.
Or, yes, being economics professors. Thank you.
Okay, so the first, one of the topics, really the one that I really wanted to touch on in the first show, but we ran out of time, is licensing laws. And I wanted to talk about licensing laws and how they affect employment or unemployment. And this is a hugely important topic and one that should be studied extensively by every listener. We're going to discuss how licensing laws increase unemployment and they drive up the cost of everything. So I'm just going to throw out a few stats to begin this segment on licensing laws. There were a study that Michael McKay showed me in preparation for this show. Dentists were able to charge 11% more in states with the most restrictive licensing laws. In the 1950s, 5% of workers needed a license. Now 20% are in an occupation that need a license to work. And approximately 30%, 1 out of every 3 workers nationwide needs a government license to do their job. So, Walter, most people take licenses for granted as a good thing because what would the world be like if there were haircutters and manicurists who didn't have licenses? Wouldn't there just be a bunch of hoodlums and swindlers out there?
Well, that's the argument in favor of it, but what you're really doing is you're harking back to the Middle Ages where you had the guild system, where you just couldn't start being a plumber or a carpenter or a candlestick maker or a baker or whatever. You had to get permission of the guild, and the guild didn't want to give you permission because they wanted to keep fewer people in there, and the fewer the people and the fewer the candles in the bakery goods, the higher the price. So this is a medieval kind of a system. Now, yes, we do want quality. We don't want, you don't want to go to a doctor, say, to take the most favorable case for licenses. You don't want to go to a doctor and, who's that doctor on The Simpsons, that crazy guy where he...
Dr. Nick.
Dr. Nick, that's right. You don't want a Dr. Nick, where you go to Dr. Nick and he sort of takes a buzzsaw and he cuts off your arm because your nose hurts or something like that. I'm exaggerating, but that's roughly Dr. Nick. Equality. And Milton Friedman is very good on this one in his book, Capitalism and Freedom. I'm not usually a fan of Milton Friedman because I think he's too weak on free enterprise, but on occupational licensure, he is sound as a bell. He is magnificent. And what he says is, look, if you have a monopoly licensing agency like the AMA or these hospitals, what they're going to do is restrict entry. They're not going to restrict entry in order to improve quality. They're going to restrict entry in order to keep people out so that their salaries can go up. And he has all sorts of evidence that that's what's going on. For example, foreign doctors. They make foreign doctors take exams in English. Well, why in English? Which precludes a lot of doctors who have some English, but English is a second language. Aren't there unconscious patients? And couldn't a non-English speaking doctor take care of unconscious patients? And what about, say, somebody from, Portugal? Couldn't he take care of fellow Portuguese or other people who speak Portuguese, like from Brazil? And that's why God invented translators. It might cost more to get a nurse who could translate, but that should be no one's business. So what Milton Friedman says is that what the AMA is doing is precluding entry. They're keeping people out so that doctors can make more money, and they've succeeded to a great degree. Doctors make a lot more money than they would in the free enterprise system, where entry were free in the sense that no one was licensed, but you would have to be certified. So what's the difference between certification and licensing? Well, in licensing, if you don't have the license, you can't practice. In certification, like the CPA, Certified Public Accountant, you have to pass a test by, the Harvard Medical School or someone like that, or the Acme Insurance Agency. And if you don't pass the test, well, you can still practice. You can be a Dr. Nick, but you can't hang up a shingle saying certified by the Harvard Medical School. Mm-hmm. And most people would, look before they leap. Before they go to Dr. Nick, they'd say, well, who certified you? And Dr. Nick would say, well, my mother did, or Homer Simpson did, or something like that, and people just wouldn't go to him. So the point that Milton Friedman makes is that you get higher quality from a competitive certification industry. Like suppose somebody certifies Dr. Nick and Dr. Nick kills someone. Well, that certification agency is going to go broke. Whereas suppose the AMA certifies a doctor who is very bad. Well, they never go broke because they're the monopoly agency. Let me just go on with one more example. This is, black people nowadays get their hair braided, very finely braided. And there are young black girls who are very good at this braiding. And they've been put in jail because they didn't go to, hair cutting school or cosmetology school, yeah. Whatever it is. Thank you. And, in order to do that, you have to take thousands of hours to study biology and all sorts of crap. And these girls don't need it, and their customers are very happy, and none of them have been hurt. It's a non-issue. And yet these poor young ladies who could have good careers in hair braiding for black and white people, I suppose some white people get that, but they're not allowed to do it. And this is just a horrendous sort of a thing. The Institute for Justice, which is a very good group, has launched several lawsuits in behalf of these young ladies to try to get the government off their back.
Mm-hmm. And on that point, it's even though the licensing laws, for example, for these young black ladies, or for as a study by Morris Kleiner from the University of Minnesota showed, these stricter laws don't even noticeably affect the quality of the service. For example, this study showed that stricter licensing laws didn't noticeably affect dental health, and I would take a gander that the putting these girls in jails didn't raise the quality of hair braiding.
Absolutely not, because the purpose of it is not to raise the quality. The purpose is to keep the monopoly privileges for the mainstream hair braiders or the mainstream cosmetologists or whoever they are. So that's the exact purpose of it. Another example I sometimes use is the case of thalidomide, which was a very good morning sickness drug, but it created in some small percentage babies with malfunctions, like 3 arms or 1 arm or something like that. And this was supported by the Food and Drug Administration. It was a complicated thing. The West German Food and Drug Administration supported it. The U.S. one allowed it, and didn't prohibit it. See, the problem there is we not only want to have good doctors and good hair braiders, we want to have good medicine and good pharmaceuticals. So what's the best way to do it? Is the best way to do it to give it the whole thing to the Food and Drug Administration and let them decide? Or is it better to have an industry that certifies quality of drugs? Mm-hmm. And you're free to have the drug if it's not certified, or certainly if it's not certified by the FDA. You see, if any private certification agency certified thalidomide, they would be broke or gone the next day. Nobody would patronize them, but the FDA is still in business. So that's like a type 1 error, accepting a bad drug. So now what the FDA does is engages in type 2 errors, namely it prohibits possibly good drugs. And now in order to get a new drug on the market... Okay,
Walter, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're coming close to the end of this segment. We will be back with our next segment, talking with Walter Block on how to create new jobs. Please stay with us. Hello, America. We are back on Radio Free Market with Dr. Walter Block talking about how to create new jobs. And Dr. Block, you were talking about the FDA and thalidomide babies. So please continue that thought.
Right. The point is that they're now creating type 2 errors where they're putting all sorts of roadblocks in the face of introducing new medicine. It takes 10 years and, many millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and meanwhile people are dying for lack of drugs. In the free enterprise system, we would have a competitive industry, and you could do whatever you wanted. If you were an adult, you could take a drug, even though none of the agencies approved of it. It's your own risk. There are these cases where people have been given, 2 months to live, they're dying of cancer, and they want to try something. They want to try experimental drugs because, that's the only shot they've got, and the bloody FDA won't allow them to do it because not only does it have to be proven not harmful, but it has to be proven beneficial. And these poor people, they're at death's door, and they want to try something. They want to throw the dice, and the bloody FDA won't allow them to. I think they ought to be put in jail for murder for preventing people from trying things.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is a travesty. I know that I have a family member who just recently had cancer, and you have to go to a different country to try these treatments that the FDA does not approve of, but nevertheless they show amazing promise to be, not as sort of harmful as chemotherapy, and it is very sad that happens. And to that point, I want to ask you about the American Medical Association. We talked about that in the last segment. One of the things that we hear today is the cost of healthcare is rising. Why? The cost of healthcare is, the government really wants to try and solve this problem. But then you look at the AMA, forces all medical schools to reject 95% of all applicants. So simple supply and demand would tell us that we're going to have a shortage of doctors. Do you think this regulation that creates a shortage of doctors probably benefits existing doctors, does it not?
Yes, it benefits existing doctors, and it pumps up their prices, which makes it difficult if you're not insured. Medical insurance is why we have that whole crisis. Namely, here the government creates the problem in the first place by not allowing medical schools to accept more applicants and by not allowing new medical schools to open. And then, after creating the problem, it tries to cure it with socialized medicine, which just exacerbates the problem. Mises talked about this, where the government creates problem A, and then it tries to solve it, which creates problem B, and each problem gets worse, C, D, and E, and you're off to the races.
I think that sort of segues into my question. It's always, you look back at history, and then the government will take the success of capitalism as their own. So can you tell us about child labor? I know that the common belief is that if the government didn't step in and have child labor laws, we'd have sweatshops and 8-year-olds working in coal mines.
Right. Well, this is another fallacy. Look, suppose we had implemented child labor laws in 1650, right before the Industrial Revolution, and said that no children under 16 can work. What would have happened? Well, a lot of 16 and under children would have died because we were so poor in those days, centuries ago, that if the children didn't work and create enough for them to eat, they would die. So this couldn't have worked then, compulsory school until 16 or something like that in the year 1650 is just ludicrous. But what happened is, thank God we had the Industrial Revolution, and then we had more of a spurt due to free enterprise in the 19th century. And each time we got richer, what the government did is it started in implementing child labor laws, and it started increasing the age at which children couldn't work, thus taking credit for what the free enterprise system was doing. In other words, the reason that the fewer and fewer children had to work was we were getting richer and richer. And the reason we were getting richer and richer is because we had free enterprise and capitalism. And then the government takes credit for it by saying, see, we raised the child labor laws, we implemented them. And it's the same not only with child labor, but with hours legislation. It used to be in the bad old days, people had to work 100, 120 hours a week just to survive. And as we got richer, we could afford to work less. And then the government kept reducing the maximum hours that we could work. So they would, let's say the capitalist system was successful, and now people, instead of working 100 hours, had to work 90. So the government would now have a new law saying, well, you can't work more than 90. And then 20 years later, we could go down to 80 hours a week thanks to free enterprise and breakthroughs. And then the government would take credit for this by implementing another law. The point is that if the government implemented the law too quickly, there would be mass starvation.
Mm-hmm. And true or false, a child can be fined or shut down for operating a lemonade stand without a license?
Yes. True. Unfortunately, there have been cases where some little tyke of age, 8 years old, sets up a lemonade stand in front of his house, and the government comes along and says, where's your business license? Are you exploiting your employees, like his mother and father who are getting the lemonade for him? It's just ludicrous what the government will do under the guise of helping us, and it's just sort of busybody socialism.
Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of interested about we'll have to address this in the next segment because we're coming close to the end. But in our next segment, I wanted to hear your comment on what kind of psychologically this does to the young population of 9 or 10-year-olds who wants to try and make some money, selling lemonade on the corner during the summer. What does this do to kind of the working age population who wants to make a living and make some money, but they're unable to because of the government? So we're going to have to talk about this in the next segment. Please stay with us on Radio Free Market. We're here with Dr. Walter Block. Hello, America. We're back on Radio Free Market with Dr. Walter Block. And I wanted to lead in the segment with this question that we addressed at the end of the last segment. What is the kind of the psychological effect on young workers who are maybe want to make some summer money, for example, selling lemonade, and they're unable to because of licensing laws?
Well, obviously it can't be very good. We're trying to socialize young people, children, into lives of productive work, and if we tell them at the get-go, right at the outset, that no, you can't do a lemonade stand, they'll go back to watching TV or something else. I don't know, maybe take piano lessons, which isn't so bad, but all facilities of children should be developed, not just piano lessons and swimming or whatever in the summer, but if they want to be, entrepreneurial and they want to sell lemonade or they want to deliver newspapers or whatever, we have all sorts of child labor laws. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't set up a lemonade stand. There are actually cases on record where parents got arrested for allowing their children to sell lemonade. And what's the poor little kitty to make of it? I mean, little Susie gets the jackboot, maybe not literally, although maybe sometimes, and she's told that, you can't do this is illicit, and she says, well, maybe there's something wrong with commerce. And that's what they teach in a lot of business schools, too. I happen to be in a business school. And you go to medical school, at least if you're admitted, they say medicine is good. And you go to law school, and they say law is great. You go to business schools, and sometimes they're apologetic about business. You want to make a profit, but not too much. So I guess it starts with young children. Young children are, in effect, told you can't work. And then also the minimum wage law, with lemonade stands, they're told they can't set up their own businesses. Minimum wage law makes it impossible for them to work for someone else. So you have hordes of kids who are a little bit bored because there's only so much swimming you can do and so much bicycle riding in the summer, and they want to work and make some money and maybe buy presents or buy a computer or whatever, and the minimum wage law prevents that as well.
Mm-hmm. I could speak directly to that about business schools. Not really demonizing people who make too much money, but certainly there's a bias towards praising CEOs, for example, who will take a pay cut or who will take a lower salary, which is honorable, absolutely, but you can definitely see the bias at a modern business school. So I have a family friend, and I won't name him, but and his view is he's a Paul Krugman fanatic, by the way. He says if it weren't for the government, we'd all be eating radioactive waste, breathing asbestos, and drinking paint in our mouths. How would you respond to this view? Because I was so stunned by that, I couldn't even respond. I was speechless.
Well, I think it's to the extent that we still have these problems, it's because of the government. It's not because of free enterprise. Because, again, what you want when you have a certification activity, the certification function, what you want is a system where if you're a good certifier, you can prosper and expand your base of operation. And if you're a bad certifier, you lose customers, people don't patronize you, people don't trust you, and eventually you have to go broke. And that's why we have reasonably good rubber bands and paper clips and pens and shoes and ties and shoelaces and pizza, because if you don't produce these things well, you lose money. And if you don't produce them well for a long enough time, you go broke. And the ones who remain are the ones who are doing a pretty good job. So we don't have a banana crisis or a burger crisis or anything like that because of the profit and loss system of free enterprise. But this works as well for certification. If you do a good job as a certifier, like, I don't know, kosher foods or good housekeeping seals of approval or things like that, well, then people trust you. And if you do a bad job, you go broke and you're out of it. Whereas when you have the government, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. And if they do a good job, they don't get more money. And if they do a bad job, they don't get less money. If they do a bad job, probably they get more money because they need more money. I don't know. Take the post office. When the post office does better off with a privatized post office industry where they can compete with each other or with one monopoly post office. Well, this insight that applies to postal delivery and to raisins and shoelaces also applies to certification. What we want is an industry where if you do a bad job, you go broke. I'm in New Orleans. We had Katrina, and because of FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, 1,800 people were killed in New Orleans. Are FEMA still in business? Yes. Is the Army Corps of Engineers still in business? Yes. Suppose 1,800 people died in Disney World. Would Disney World be in business anymore? Of course not.
Absolutely. So our listeners, I hope you're starting to see that these government laws that, whether they are well-intentioned or not, they hurt usually the poorest of the poor, the people who are least capable. So I want to relate that to taxes. How do tax increases affect business people, and especially the smaller ones?
Well, right now, the reason businesses isn't hiring is because of something that Robert Higgs calls regime uncertainty. Namely, they're sort of like deer caught in the headlights. They're frozen. They don't know what to do. Obama keeps changing the rules, keeps changing everything, and people are afraid to hire. So you get that sort of a phenomenon. When taxes go up or they keep changing, business are less able than otherwise to hire people, to allow jobs to be created. When the government taxes more money gets circulated through the so-called public sector, namely the socialist sector, and less through the private sector. Our unemployment rate isn't as bad as it would be, except for the fact that the government is hiring a lot of people to work for the government. And the way they can do that is to raise taxes so they can pay the salaries of the workers. I don't know. I go around the streets of New Orleans and I see these people that are cleaning the streets or fixing the streets, and there are 50 of them, and 49 of them are standing around looking, just holding their shovels, and one of them is digging. If you had private enterprise, that kind of a company would go broke. So the point is, we can create all the jobs we want, and they created a lot of jobs in Russia under the Soviet system, where everything was funneled through the government sector. You could have a lot of jobs, but then you had hidden unemployment where the workers were, some workers were creating hammers, but nobody was creating nails, and vice versa, and the Soviet system went belly up. So the more taxes we have, the more government enterprise we have, and the less private enterprise, the more toward the Soviet system of communism we go, the worse we're going to be.
What if we didn't have taxes? How would the world survive? Like, aren't there just some things that are so big that only the government can do, like building freeways or ports or the Panama Canal?
Well, one of my recent books is on why we should privatize highways, so it's apropos here. I don't think there's anything that private enterprise can't do. Let me just say this before I get into that. There are two types of libertarians. One is anarchist libertarians or anarcho-capitalists, and the other is minimal government libertarians or minarchists. And the anarchists say that everything can be done by private enterprise, and the government need not do anything. Whereas the minarchists say, well, there are certain things that only the government can do, and the main role that they assign to the government is the protection of persons and property rights. And to that end, you need three institutions, according to the Randians, who would be minarchists, an example. One, you need armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, not, Ron Paul would say, to go out and have 100 or 1,000 military bases in 200 different countries. Second, police to keep local bad guys off of us, not to uphold drug laws and victimless crime laws, which put people in jail unnecessarily, but to stop murders and rapes and theft. And three, courts to decide who the good guys and the bad guys are. But whether you're a minarchist libertarian or an anarchist libertarian, no one would say in that field or in that philosophy would say, well, there are certain things that are too big that only government can do, because that's why God invented the stock market. If there's something really big that I want to go to the moon or I want to go to Mars, and if people think that this is going to be a paying proposition and that would be a real big expenditure, what I do is I float a bond issue or a stock issue on Wall Street, and I say, hey, I got a company. We're going to go to the moon and get green cheese, and we're going to sell it or something like that. And I'll give you a share if you give me $100, and I'll sell 10 million shares, and I'll have $1 billion, and I'll go off and I'll start doing it. So, I mean, where does government get the money from in the first place to make a Panama Canal or to make roads or to make bridges or to make moonshots or whatever? It gets it through taxes, namely millions of people pay it. Well, millions of people could pay it if they thought it was a good idea through the stock market.
So the government's just big enough to waste that large enough of money.
Oh, the government and waste is, waste is government's middle name. And again, the reason for that is that they don't have this market weeding out system which rewards profitable non-waste and penalizes waste.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I really recommend that everyone pick up a copy of Defending the Undefendable, because it has so many topics that you would just never think should be legal or could be legal or could work, but they do in just this voluntary framework that libertarians talk about. So last interview we were only able really briefly to touch upon one of my favorite topics, which is the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and the money creation. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard somewhere or the other that the government prints money, quote, out of thin air. So first, Walter, does the Federal Reserve actually print money out of thin air?
Well, they do a little bit nowadays. Most of it is now just banking deposits, entries into banking statements. But yes, the government creates money, whether it's cash, which would be printing it, or through the banking system. Yes, the government creates money through thin air. They can create as much money as they want. Our man Bernanke, Benny the paper hanger Bernanke, is having quantitative easing 1 and quantitative easing 2, and who knows, quantitative easing 3. These are just words for creating more money. Now, this is a horrible thing in two ways. One, when the government creates more money, we have inflation. And one of the reasons that we had World War II and the rise of Hitler is because we had the German hyperinflation of 1923, which just undermined the German society, and Hitler came in as partially as a result of that. Zimbabwe now, you can be a zillionaire, a loaf of bread costs $3 trillion. We're happily not at that point. We don't have hyperinflation. We don't even have inflation now, much of it, but he's been creating a lot of money, Bernanke, and the banks haven't been lending it out, but and soon I expect the banks to start lending it out, and when they do, with the multiplier, with the fractional reserve system that we have, if the fractional reserve is 10%, which it roughly is, they'll create 10 times as much money as the money that the Fed creates. And this brings me to another point about unemployment, which is the main subject of the hour. What what the Fed does when it creates money, it does two things. One, it increases prices, and that's inflation. But it does something, and sort of a lot of people know about this, although not everyone knows about it. Some people blame corporate greed for inflation, but most, at least economists or sophisticated people in economics, know that the government creates money, and that feeds inflation, and we have the quantity theory of money. But there's a much more insidious thing that also happens when the Fed creates money, and that is that it lowers interest rates artificially lower than they otherwise would have been. And what this does is it leads to production or investment in areas that never would have been invested in if the interest rate hadn't been artificially lowered. I don't know how much time we've got more in this segment. It's sort of a complicated issue, so I'll start now on this, and if I don't have time, maybe I can continue in the next segment.
We have about 4 minutes, so what Dr. Block is about to explain is the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And also we have a couple of shows upcoming where we're going to talk about Keynesian versus Austrian ideas of why this happens. So what you're about to hear is very important, and it's called the Austrian theory of the business cycle. So go ahead, Dr. Block. You have about 3 minutes.
Oh, well, it's a tough road to hoe, but I'll make a start.
We have faith in you.
Let me approach this circuitously. I'm a professor. I'm never supposed to say anything directly. Right now, the allocation of resources between, rubber bands and raisins is okay. In other words, there's no crisis. No one is saying we have way too many raisins and way too few rubber bands. But suppose the government started subsidizing raisins and started taxing rubber bands, such that we had many, many more raisins than we would otherwise want and many fewer rubber bands than we would otherwise want. And they kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And then what happened is that a lot of people left their jobs in rubber bands and started employment in raisins. And then all of a sudden they had to stop. And now we would see that there are investments in raisins that were silly to have made. We're up to our armpits in raisins. We don't need all those raisins. And there's vast unemployment in the raisin industry, and there's vast underemployment in the rubber band industry. Well, what we need now is to not prop up the raisin industry anymore. It's been propped up too much. Rather, we need to get people out of raisins and into rubber bands, and that's going to take a while because, people just don't go instantaneously from a job that they shouldn't be in to a job they should be in. Okay, well, now let's get, with that introduction, let's get into Austrian business cycle theory. What the lowering of the interest rate does, it does not subsidize raisins, but it subsidizes something else. Namely, it subsidizes heavy industry. The Austrians believe in this thing called the structure of production. Capital is not a homogeneous good. There are various kinds of capital. There's some capital that's heavy industry, and they create stuff that is years and years away from consumption, like mining or heavy manufacturing or houses or cars or things like that. It takes a long time to make those things. On the other hand, what a lower interest rate does is it takes investments away from industries that are shorter run, that are closer to consumption, say retailing and wholesaling. So what we have is way too many people in cars and houses and mines and factories, and way too few people in retailing. And that's what the reason for that is according to the Austrian business cycle theory of Hayek and Mises and Rothbard. The reason for that is that the government artificially lowered the interest rate, and this served as a subsidy or a inducement or an incitement on the part of entrepreneurs to invest in roundabout methods of production, Bomberwerk, another Austrian would say, and not enough investments in these other areas. So I think the analogy between raisins and rubber bands is an apt one, and the reason I mention raisins and rubber bands is that it's easier for people to wrap their minds around it, whereas it's harder for them to see long-run goods and short-run goods. But the reason we have a housing bubble is because houses are a long-term investment. Am I running out of time?
We have about 20 seconds left. Yeah, I'm going to take it from here. We're coming near the end of the segment, folks. So we're going to be back here with Dr. Walter Block talking about job creation. We'll come back. We will talk a little more about the Federal Reserve and the business cycle. So stay with us. We'll be back on RadioFreeMarket.com.
Welcome back to Radio Free Market. We're here with Dr. Walter Block. Dr. Block was just telling us about the business cycle theory, the Austrian business cycle theory, and why so many people built and bought houses in this last housing bubble. Dr. Block?
Yes, I think I would like to mention several books that people could follow up on. Perhaps the best introduction to this is a thing by Murray Rothbard, which is called Depressions, Their Cause and Cure. All of this stuff is available for free, I think, on the Mises web. Certainly that one is. There's a book by Robert Murphy, who is an excellent critic of Krugman on business cycle theory, and he's got a book on the Great Depression. Another one is Murray Rothbard's book called The Great Depression. And then there's one by Tom Woods, a book called Meltdown. I forget, it's a longer title. It's got a subtitle, but Meltdown is the key element there. So if people would get a hold of those 4 books, they would have a very good introduction into this. I've only barely scratched the surface of it. Another contributor to this is Roger Garrison, and then, of course, there's Hayek, but now we're getting into more technical stuff that maybe people who are studying this seriously would get involved in.
Okay, so the answer to all of these issues that all these things that we've talked about that cause unemployment, licensing, and taxes, the answer to all of these seems to be the free market. In your opinion, does the free market mean utopia? Is that what we're trying to tell people?
Well, I agree. Free enterprise is the cure for what ails you, but free enterprise will not bring about a utopia. The only thing that will do that is manna and heaven and the Garden of Eden and stuff like that, which is very unrealistic. No, the free enterprise system will just enable human beings, imperfect human beings, to do the best they can given their limitations of intelligence, of initiative, of entrepreneurial ability. The free enterprise system will just enable human beings to do the best they can. Whereas when you substitute the government for the free enterprise system, then human capacities decrease and we create poverty. So the free enterprise system is not a utopia. If we had free enterprise, we're not going to cure all disease and there'd still be some poverty, but less disease and less poverty and more wealth and more human cooperation.
Mm-hmm. So, we talk about the business cycles. In a free market, there will most likely be business fluctuations and periods of relatively higher unemployment. But, in our opinion, the free market at least minimizes the scope of damage that would be done to the economy during a business cycle type event. Could you comment on that?
Well, Murray Rothbard, in his book, Depressions, Cause and Cure, which is a mini book, a very small book, goes into this and says, look, if hula hoops come into effect or hula hoops are suddenly popular, there'll be unemployment because people are going to have to be drawn away from other tasks and put into hula hoop factories, and there'll be transitional unemployment as you get them from one place to another. And then when the hula hoop phase goes out and entrepreneurs are left with unsold hula hoops, well, now all the people in the hula hoop factories are going to have to go do other things that people now want, like, I don't know what, umbrellas, paper clips, who knows. So people keep changing their minds. Styles change. Do you know how the automobile industry devastated the horse and buggy industry? I mean, it just created vast unemployment among whip makers and horse breakers and people like that. And the computer industry created vast unemployment in the typewriter industry. I don't know, you people are probably too young to know what a typewriter is, but a typewriter is sort of like a computer without a computer. It's got a keyboard and you type directly onto paper. Well, this sort of unemployment is not generalized unemployment, Murray Rothbard would say. It's just the fact that inventions occur or tastes change, and you'll get some unemployment, transitional unemployment, as people are led by Adam Smith's invisible hand out of typewriters and into computers or out of horse.
Walter, I hate to interrupt you because that's such a great point, but that is the end of our show today. So just want to leave our listeners and thank you to Walter Block for being with us today. This is Aaron Brown and Zoe Russell with Radio Free Market. Please visit us on the web at radiofreemarket.com, where you can subscribe for free to all of our shows and our archives for easy downloads. Until next week, wherever you are, please stand up for freedom. Thank you for listening.